Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and take our seats. Zoom people, we're going to try our best. Sean is not in here right now, so I'm going to pull up the chat. If you have any questions, comments, please holler, and we will try to get you guys answered. Yeah. Okay. Afternoon, guys. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Keep eating the sugar. You need to wake up for me here in a minute. Okay, we're going to get started on bleeding control. So disclaimer is that I am not getting paid to represent any one brand over another. I have a representation of all the approved brands that we should be using. I know I was told most of you guys use CATS, which are great. They are COTC approved. We'll talk about that. But I don't get paid by anyone to do any of this stuff, okay? All the guidelines I have are from the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care, or COTC, C-O-T-C-C. We're going to call it COTC from now on. They released their guidelines in 2020. They have a couple little supplemental things that have been released since then, and I've updated all my material to that point. So all bleeding stops eventually. We kind of heard that, and it was kind of a joke, but it really is a legit phrase. Of course, it was paraphrased from French to English, but a surgeon named Guy de Chauliac made that rule, like all bleeding does stop eventually. We need to figure out how to stop it completely. So the leading cause of death on the battlefield is uncontrolled extremity bleeding. These stats are taken from all the major battles in which we record keeping. So that includes Civil War all the way up to the Middle Eastern conflict, and we're still going to be keeping track of this. So the second leading cause of death is from civilian trauma. So in the battlefield, they did another really good study in Vietnam. They took all the names from the Vietnam Wall, which if you've seen that, it's massive. And they looked up records on each of these people. So of the roughly 58,000 men and women who died in combat in Vietnam, about 50% of those people died from extremity bleeding. 50% of that 58,000. Of that 50%, about 11% could have been saved from a non-surgical intervention, meaning put a tourniquet on and the doc could have sewed them up and they would have been fine. But they didn't. So that's why we had such a massive loss in Vietnam. We have since learned the importance of bleeding control and tourniquet application, as well as some medications that we had. So here we have the latest study, Battlefield Trauma Care, a decade of COTC. And more statistics are coming in from the Middle Eastern conflict, Afghanistan, all these, and they are showing over and over and over again that uncontrolled extremity bleeding is the leading cause of military death. So military versus civilian setting, it's slightly different. In the military setting, we've got a lot more shrapnel, a lot more bullet wounds. Unless you live on the inner city, you're going to see more of that stuff. We have first and rescue members, they're different. And with the military, we have Navy corpsmen coming in, and they work with Marines, and they secure the scene, they get these people out. They've had a lot of training, but in a very short amount of time. I mean, they cram it into you pretty fast because they've got to crank out the corpsmen. And then the evacuation time is ironically shorter in the civilian setting because this country is flooded with rescue helicopters. And I'm not dogging that, it's just a fact. So in the military setting, you may be waiting 30 minutes to an hour for a helicopter to get to you to evacuate your wounded. Here, well, at least in my area, you might have to wait 15, 20 minutes. And even then, ground people are like, why is it taking so long? You know, so that is a little bit different. So the different battlefields, again, goes into military. I mentioned shrapnel, bullets, it's penetrating trauma. It mostly is penetrating trauma. So shootings, shrapnel, explosions. Occasionally, you'll have explosions that throw them back and they get blunt force, but that typically doesn't cause extremity bleeding. It may cause internal bleeding depending on how you land. And then civilian is usually blunt trauma. And that would be from your automobile accidents, your agricultural settings, your assaults, anything like that. So a very famous case was 2013, the Boston bombing. This is Jeff Bauman. He's the one sitting in the wheelchair. And you can see here the red arrow points to both his legs being blown off. He was near the finish line when those bombs went off. So they were able to scoop him up. This is Carlos Arredondo in the cowboy hat. He was helping this guy and these two other people try to get him to a trauma center. They threw him in a chair and they started rolling. And what they did was somebody took a white t-shirt and ripped it up and made a makeshift tourniquet and a compression bandage for Jeff's legs. Well, the tatters that were now blood-soaked got wound up in the spokes of the wheel. So on magazines, it shows, if you see Carlos's fingers, they're pinching. And it looks, if you can see, this picture's not real clear, but it looks like he's holding arteries or vessels. And that's what a magazine had mistakenly done was, Carlos Arredondo saved this man's life by clamping off his arteries. That's a pretty neat dissection for a bomb to be able to go off and isolate the arteries alone and clean them up. So truth came out and Carlos is like, no, you guys don't understand. Those were blood-soaked tatters of a white cotton t-shirt that got wound up in the spokes. They backed up the chair, unwound it, and he's just holding up the bloody tatters as they're running to the nearest first aid station hospital. This is Jeff a couple of years later. He was actually the protagonist of the movie Stronger, about his life. Jake Gyllenhaal portrayed him. When he got to the hospital with those injuries, he was coded at least 3 times. He got massive blood transfusions a couple times over, so really he didn't have any of his own blood left. But he made it and he looks so much better. So the D's of bleeding control, that would be detect that bleeding. Identify this as an uncontrolled bleed. Direct pressure first, always, device, and then don't dilute. Now, when I took EMT training many years ago, tourniquet was the second to last thing on the list on National Registry. Now, it's number 2. Direct pressure, tourniquet. And we don't mess around with it. We don't delay. We're like, oh, if I put this on, they're going to lose their arm or leg. No. Studies have shown that this thing can be on for hours. 2-3 hours is fine. Nothing more than 6. But there's improvements in this to help the patient be more comfortable. We can get blood flow to certain things. So we'll talk about some of the advancements we have here. The other one is don't dilute. We'll talk about that. So tourniquets were first thought to be used in 4th century BC. It was a jumble of rags, sticks, animal skins, leather straps, whatever they could find to try to clamp off that bleeding. In 1700s, surgeons actually began experimenting with different tourniquets during orthosurgeries and vascular surgeries to try to staunch that bleeding so they could get the repair done without blood constantly flowing into that area. So they were starting to experiment in the 1700s. And then Royal Navy sailors were encouraged to carry tourniquets on them to help their other sailors. And now that is a standard today in law enforcement. You carry at least 2 tourniquets, 1 for you, 1 for your friend, 2 for your friend, maybe more, just depends on the agency. So the death on the battlefield study kind of goes along with the Vietnam study, but this was from 2011, so they expanded and they included the Middle Eastern conflict. When we started making tourniquets number 2 on the list for bleeding control, deaths from extremity hemorrhage decreased by 67%. So this is proven over and over again that this works. It's non-invasive. It's a BLS procedure. We need to be very aggressive with this. Unfortunately, with the increase in bombings and school shootings, we're getting really good at this. And that is unfortunate. So the tourniquet qualities, I mentioned COTC. They are the all-being military experts on certain things, specifically trauma, and they are who civilians go to monitor this, to see what are you finding out there, what works, what doesn't. So COTC made these recommendations. These are the must-haves for tourniquets in order for them to approve them for military use, which filters down into civilian use. First one being no decrease in pressure applied as time goes by. Has anyone ever had to retighten a tourniquet? Couple of us, yeah. Yeah, so you put that pressure on there, that pressure must maintain that pressure for the entire duration until you take it off. So that's number one, no decrease in pressure. The other one is repeatable and consistent. I need to be able to put that tourniquet on the same way every single time, and it gives the same amount of pressure every single time. Third quality, easy to use, one hand preferably. We go through drills, and I didn't bring my, I had my tourniquets, but I accidentally mailed them off home Friday. So I don't have them to demo, but that's okay because we've got our Zoom landers, they can't see anyway. So we're gonna talk about this. You want to be able to apply it with one hand to you or somebody else. You need to be able to do that because your other hand might be busy, it might be blown off, you don't know. So be able to apply it easily with one hand. Minimal training, doesn't take long to learn how to use a tourniquet. Cost effective and easy to obtain. Cost effective, not necessarily, we'll talk about that. Easy to obtain, absolutely. You know, our medical supply places, our Boundtrees, our Carl stores, our places should be able to get these things to us. And then wider bands. This is a new-ish rule. So they want you to have wider bands on your tourniquets. The reason being is narrow bands, if you think about it, they hurt worse because there's less surface area. So let's think about cutting a birthday cake, okay? I've got a birthday cake here. I'm going to cut it with a baseball bat that has what, 2, 3, 4 inches width. I can cut through that cake, but it's not going to be real clean. It's going to have a larger surface area. Now let's think about using something narrower like a cake knife. That's going to slice clean through and it's going to have a very little surface area. We don't want this to cut into our patient's limbs, so we want a wider band. The other thing that we need to look at is the wider it is, the more compression on their artery that you're putting on. So you're just doubling over your bleeding control efforts. So make sure you have wider bands. 1 inch in width is pretty standard, more is better. So the different brands of COTC approved tourniquet brands out there. COTC was not paid to represent any of these brands, but they do come out and say these brands meet these standards. Okay, so we've got the CAT, Gen 6 and Gen 7. Both of them work just great. In fact, they are the most popular option out there. Military recommends CATs, and I know you guys have them. A ratcheting mechanical medical tourniquet, or an RMT, and that would be the TX2 and the TX3, two different versions. They still work great. The SAM XT, the Soft T, or the Softy tactical tourniquet, wide, about 2 inches in width. And then the tactical mechanical tourniquet, it is also wide. So those are your approved brands. Is there anyone out here who uses something other than CAT? Okay, and then what about, see here, CATs. You all have CATs, so there's not really a problem. Sometimes people are like, well, we have the RAT. Well, the RAT is fine, but we're going to find out why this doesn't work. So, tips on tourniquets: apply directly to the skin 2 to 3 inches above the bleeding site. If that first tourniquet fails, it shouldn't, but we'll talk about why it might fail in here in a minute. Apply a second one right next to the first one, either above or below or just overlapping. So that way you reinforce what's already there. So I mentioned CATs. They have been shown to be 100% effective in occluding blood flow by the U.S. Army Institute of Research. That's why the military uses them. That's why they are the most popular ones out there. And that's why a lot of EMS agencies have them, is because, hey, if it's good enough for our soldiers, it's good enough for us. So the counterfeits, remember I said cost effective. So there are counterfeits out there, specifically of the cats. You can Google all the stuff that you need to look for. However, I've got a little cheat sheet right here. The real cat tourniquets will have raised lettering on that plastic buckle. So others have a recessed. It looks like it's been lasered in. Those are fake. So they must have raised lettering. They must have deep ribbing on the handles. There we go. Others are, they're almost smooth. So make sure you get your deep ribbing. And then right here, it should be sonic welded, which means heat stamped. So all the plastic has melted together. The fake ones are stitched. Now there's more things that you can look for. Again, you can have to Google this, but I can tell you right now, when I used to fly, we got a big case of these and the boss was so excited because we saved a bunch of money. It was knockoffs from China. And we had a gentleman who was in a motorcycle accident, bleeding from an amputated leg. And so we put the generic cat on there, not knowing the windlass broke immediately, that strap, immediately. We put on the second one, it broke. So we ended up going old school Boy Scout, and we had straps and a stick and we twisted it and secured it down. It worked fine. But then incident reports came out, and then root cause analysis was done, and then they're like, oh, we didn't get those from Boundtree. We didn't get them from a legit source. Yeah, we ordered them off the internet for like 10 bucks a piece instead of 45. So be very, very cognizant of this. Make sure you look at your cats and know that they are brand name. The extra bucks that you pay for that is worth it. So the next one is a ratcheting mechanical tourniquet or medical tourniquet. The TX2 and the TX3, both wide. They're 2 inches wide. This has the instructions printed right on it, which I love. Pull this tight, and then you lift this little strap, and it clicks its way up that ratchet until it gets super tight. And then you can secure it. And then you just lift it back up, and it will unratchet itself when you're ready to release it. The next one is a SAM XT. This is interesting if you've ever had any kind of SAM tourniquets, SAM pelvic splints, you know that this thing has a pressure gauge in it. And so these 2 holes are overlapping 2 pins that are flush with the buckle. And you cannot secure this until you pull enough force on it that it activates those pins to snap up, and the pins catch the 2 holes, you're secured. Because we're used to, like with cats or the RMTs, we pull it back, we snug it up, we wrap it around, get that Velcro in there, and then we twist. There's no Velcro here. So we're pulling, we're like, well, and we pull back and forth, and we're like, how is this thing going to catch? You got to pull hard. You may have to brace that with your hand. Pull steady, don't yank on it because they're injured, but pull steady and keep on pulling, and you'll think, my God, this thing's never, and pretty soon you hear a click, and you're like, you can let go because the 2 pins have released up there onto the strap. Same thing with the pelvic splints, T-pods, any of those others, we're not putting enough force on there, and we think we're doing a lot of force, but when you really feel it, you're like, oh wow, this was not enough. So SAMs, same thing. You pull and pull and pull until you hear the click, and then those 2 pins come up, and they've secured your pelvis with the exact amount of pressure you need to put on that pelvis. The SAM pelvics, yeah. Yep. You have one, but what? Okay, all right. So soft, wide, or soft T, sometimes they'll call them soft Ts. They are the wide tactical tourniquets. They have an aluminum bar here that has some grip on it. So like it's sandblasted or something. It's got some grip to it. So it can actually grip onto the material and give you a really good arterial compression. So here's the tactical mechanical tourniquet. Same thing, it's got an aluminum bar across the top. It's wide and it is reinforced. So the only two pneumatic tourniquets, and they are pneumatic, so think of blood pressure cuffs. This one looks like a blood pressure cuff. You put it on, you pump it up to a certain pressure, and you know you've got blood occlusion. This one works similarly, it's just the cuff is only this wide all the way through it instead of that wide. That's the Delphi EMT 2, I'm sorry, Delphi EMT and the Tactical Pneumatic Tourniquet 2. First generation didn't make the cut. So this is second generation pneumatics. So what about tourniquet conversion? A tourniquet conversion is where you've got the bleeding stopped. Now, could you possibly get that tourniquet off while maintaining blood occlusion? Because tourniquets hurt. If you've ever had one on somebody and it's legitimately tight enough, you can't give them enough, fentanyl, morphine, they're still hollering. It's an ischemic pain that is deep, and no amount of pain medicine will get rid of it completely. But it's necessary to save that person's life. So let's say you've got bleeding occlusion, we're good, starting to clot off, the arm is pulseless, we're en route. Could we potentially take that tourniquet off? And that's fine. We're told no too. Yeah, you're not wrong. But there is something in this world called tourniquet conversion, and it is the possibility that you might be able to take it off. I'm saying no either, don't do it. You do your protocol. My protocol does not approve this either. I'm just going to let you know that it exists, okay? So if you wanted to try to convert a tourniquet, follow your protocol, but here's how they would do it, and that would be if you can do it within 2 hours, that's going to be better than nothing. If it's been over 6 hours, don't touch it, because the arm has had too much ischemia now, all kinds of chemical changes has happened within the arm, just don't even. The criteria for this would be the casualty is not in shock. You've stopped the bleeding, they've got a good pressure, they're pink, warm, and dryish, okay. The other one is it would be possible, it has to be possible to monitor that wound closely. If I was still flying, because in the ambulance I see everything head to toe, but in flying it's in my head. So if I had somebody with a femoral bleed and I was in an old 105, I can only access my patient from the waist up. I don't want to convert that tourniquet, because en route, what if that thing starts bleeding again? I won't see it, not until their pressure starts falling. And then how am I going to stop it? I can't exactly crawl down the tunnel and re-occlude it. So that's the other criteria that you need to have. And the tourniquet is not being used to control bleeding from an amputated extremity. If that is the case, leave it on, because there's no amount of bleeding control you're going to be able to do with that. So how you would do this is you expose the wound, it's been tourniqueted off, you've got bleeding control. Expose that wound, make sure that it's still intact, there's nothing new since you put that tourniquet on. Get a tight roll of gauze and shove it into the deepest part of that wound. You have not taken the tourniquet off yet. So, tourniquet still on, inspect the wound, shove a gauze roll down into the wound as tight as you can get it, maintain constant pressure of that gauze for 3 minutes at least, then apply a pressure bandage on top of that, and then you loosen the tourniquet. How quickly do you loosen it? Well, that's, that, I hear both sides, and I hear vascular surgeons say this. Some say do it slowly, because then if it starts rebleeding, we can just clamp it down. And then others are like, just release it, because if it's going to pop, it's going to pop. I'd rather know now than 10 minutes from now. So I don't have the answer for how quickly you need to loosen that tourniquet to remove it. And I can't get anyone to agree on it either. So it doesn't matter, our protocol doesn't cover it, but I do want you to be familiar with this concept. This is called an IT clamp. This is the only adjunct, it's an alternative hemostatic adjunct recommended by COTC. It's like a hair clip, but they've got these little barbs on here. These two plastic side pieces press in like this, and the clamp opens up. And then it's, if you've ever done butterfly bandages, you put the clamps and the needles in one side of the wound, you drag that thing across the other side and get the needles to embed in the other side of the wound, and then you pinch on that clamp and get it to shut. Yeah, not pleasant, but it is extremely effective. So it is for compressible hemorrhages. It can be used in addition to combat gauze. Here it says IT clamp may be used alone or in conjunction with hemostatic dressing or an X-stat. So there is a 90% success rate in less than 10 seconds if you want to put this thing on, and it's a BLS skill. It's the only non-tourniquet device intended for care under fire. It works that well. It does not include distal perfusion, and it eliminates the need for your 3 minutes of manual pressure because it's creating its own pressure by you clamping down on it. So really cool thing here. These would be excellent sites to put your IT clamp on. You can put it anywhere on the body, but those places that are hard to compress, like the axilla and groin, these would be great for it. So here we have it. It was FDA cleared to be used in compressible areas of the body. Here you can see we're going to stretch it across the wound, drag it in. Here's your bleeder right here, and then we're going to clamp it down. 100% survival in lethal groin injuries. So they're a little expensive. I priced them. They're about 50 bucks a piece. I personally, in 30 years, have never needed to use one, thank goodness. But they're there, and they work really, really well. No. Mm-mm. Yeah, exactly. So they are not in the Stop the Bleed kits because it's not meant for lay people. So the question for people out on Zoom is, are they reusable? No, they are not. And then the other question is, what was it? Military use. They're too bulky. You can't use them in a Stop the Bleed because they have 4 sharp points on either side. Can you imagine a lay person who doesn't know how to do this, mess with that thing? You're going to get needle sticks. And then they can't use it on their patient because they stuck their own O cells with it. It takes about, I don't know, 5 minutes of training on this. But once you know where those points are, you're not going to touch it. So, but no, they're not on the national Stop the Bleed kits. So we have hemostatic agent. We've talked about tourniquets. Let's talk a little bit about hemostatic agents. We've got Celox, Chita gauze, X-stat, and then we've got the IT clamp we talked about. The things that we use for COTC recommended hemostatic agents. They are not considered to be a first line treatment. Direct pressure is always going to be started with, okay? You will use it with direct pressure, not instead of. And it is to be applied to the source of the bleed. You know, tourniquets we apply above the bleed. This is going to go right in the hole, in the source of the bleed. You need to report what type of agent you used, whether it's Celox or Chitosan, and then if you used gauze pads or rolls, count them. I know in the heat of the moment, you don't want to have to be counting bloody 4x4s, but you can, like if you have the package of 4x4s, rip open the package, put the label in your pocket. Because on that label, it will say, you know, this contains 10 sponges. That's what they call them, sponges. And I use 2 of those. So you need to tell the doc, I've got 20 of these bloody 4x4s in there. Because when cotton, gauze, any of that stuff gets bloody, it looks like human tissue. And the last thing you want to do is leave that thing in there for it to get infected. Same thing with the rolls of gauze. How many rolls did you use? Make sure and give that to the receiving team. So normal clotting occurs when platelets, which are actually recycled red blood cells, platelets, you know, they bump along each other in the bloodstream. They're nice and smooth and, you know, they do their thing and then they become activated. Activated is like in this picture, they throw out little spikes, kind of like, and they start grabbing on to everything around it. Plasma, proteins, other red blood cells, white blood cells, all the stuff. And when that happens, it actually creates a mesh. So then this mesh is hanging out here with big holes. And then as blood is flowing through there, that mesh captures the red blood cells and makes a clot. The whole point of red blood cells in a clot is to give it its pretty red color. That's all red blood cells are doing. You're relying on plasmin, plasminogen, fibrin, all the platelets. You're relying on that stuff to control your bleeding. Red blood cells have nothing to do with it. It just gives it its pretty red color. So then clotting factors flood to the area, and then we have chemical changes in our body. So from there, we've got some hemostatic agents we can work with. So some hemostatic agents actually will soak up blood, like when you make gravy and you throw flour in there and the flour swells up and makes thick gravy. That's what they're doing here. Some of them will actually soak up the plasma portion of the blood and create a gel, and that kind of holds things back. Some will swell up into, some will soak up the plasma portion of blood and filter it out, and that makes you hemoconcentrated. Some will activate the clotting cascade of the patient's own blood at a chemical level. So the forms that we have for hemostatic agents, first of all, injectable liquids and pastes, they exist. We don't have them in EMS, and we probably won't, and that's okay. But I need to let you know they exist, okay? So we're going to move on. Granules and impregnated gauze. So first of all, again, injectable liquids or pastes are only done in ORs. They are not done in EMS, and I don't see it happening because it's quite technical. It's like JB Weld, you have to mix together and let it cure. Yeah, it ain't working. So we don't use that for EMS. Granules, we are no longer going to use granules. Does anyone still have granules left in their kits? I can't even find it on eBay, and that's pretty bad. So granules we don't use because you can't use them in windy conditions because they'll blow away. If the patient is leaning over, you can't throw granules up into a wound. They are hard for surgeons to clean out of wounds. Surgeons will give you the side eye if you bring somebody in and you've used granules on their wound. It's already dirty to begin with. It's full of grass and dirt and teeth and whatever else. And they're having to do a gross decontamination, and then you've got granules in there that will actually kind of melt into the tissue. Takes them hours and hours to get that stuff out. So surgeons hate that stuff. It is potentially lethal if one of those granules gets picked up by your circulation and it goes into your vascular. You can die from it. So granules are no longer recommended by COTC. What we have is impregnated gauze. It is the preferred way of applying a hemostatic agent. So the characteristics, we know characteristics of tourniquets, characteristics of hemostatic agents. Rapid onset in less than 2 minutes. We've got to have this stuff ready to roll. No side effects, no burns, no toxicity, no allergic reactions, no risk to responder. We can't be breathing this stuff in. We did with granules. Sometimes the powder would get up there and like, no, this stuff is fine. It's simple, ready to apply, remove. You can remove it very easily. It has a good shelf life. It's affordable, that's relatively speaking. Small, lightweight, easy to store, stable in multiple different conditions. Some of the other granules didn't work in less than 40 degrees. Well, that's most of our winter. So this stuff has to be able to work in all conditions. It has to be biodegradable, bioabsorbable, and should not wash away with rapid bleeding. So a lot of characteristics out there. So let's look at our types. The approved brands are Combat Gauze, which is also called QuikClot, same thing. Then we have Celox, Kyta Gauze, and X-Stats. So the application, it doesn't matter what brand you use. The application is always going to be the same. You're going to fill that bleeding wound with the gauze as tight as you can. It's not going to be comfortable for your patient. If they say, ooh, that tickles, you're probably not doing it right. Firm pressure for at least 3 minutes, and then apply additional dressing on top of that wound and prepare for transport. So quick clot, first thing we're going to talk about, original generation quick clot. The stuff prior to 2009 is what I'm saying. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah, the stuff was made of zeolite, which is a calcium-based thing. If you've ever given calcium or seen calcium being given to a patient in their IV, their arm gets really red and their face will get really red. Because when calcium is mixed with water, like the plasma portion of blood, it is exothermic, meaning it makes heat and it sends it out. So a lot of these folks who are being treated with first generation quick clot was actually getting burns, like really bad burns. We'll see here in a minute why that is, okay? How it works though is it acts like a sieve. So fluid can flow through this stuff, but what it does is it will allow the liquid portion to be soaked up, and that gives you a hemoconcentration. And when you hemoconcentrate something, the fibers that make a mesh that makes the clot will shorten up and tighten quicker. So you have quicker clotting. So the first and second generation had some drawbacks. We talked about this. The zeolite was actually technically kitty litter because it did absorb fluids just like kitty litter does, and it was used as kitty litter. Zeolite is very, very porous, and it is very, very hard to remove from wounds. The calcium created those exothermic actions, and it would actually boil in a patient's wound, which some surgeons are like, well, it's kind of cautery, right? But you still had to treat burns. So I was able to secure a package of the original zeolite quick clot, the granules. This video was done at home. I had my son record it. I want you to watch what happens because my plate has the zeolite in it, and I'm going to add water. So imagine this being in a wound. This is the zeolite that contains calcium. Remember, when calcium combines with water, sorry. There we go. It was boiling. And now that wound has blood in it, and you're pouring those granules into that wound, and it is boiling. So needless to say, that was not recommended. And they changed their recipe in, I think, 2006. See here, yeah, 2006 was when they changed the recipe. And they replaced zeolite calcium with kaolin. And it's been great ever since. So the kaolin still initiates the body's clotting cascade, so you get that body compensating thing. It no longer produces heat as a byproduct because kaolin is clay. So we're good there. It is now available in the gauze, and you don't see it in the gauze, but when you pull it out, you can actually feel like a powdery film on it, and that's that kaolin that's just a very thin layer. So kaolin is a clay-like product found everywhere in the world. We harvest ours from Georgia. They apparently have a huge amount of kaolin down there. It is a natural clay-like material. When dried, it becomes hydrophilic, which means water-loving. So it loves to soak up excess fluids. Another product that had kaolin in it was kaopectate. Kaolin and pectin, which is a natural fruit fiber that when it is warmed up and given fluids, it will actually soak up into a gelatin like pectin. Possibly, but maybe not. The thing is, that's a good question. And we had kaopectate when we were kids with diarrhea. Mom would shake it up. It was a pinky brown colored stuff. You drank it down, and it would coat the inside of your intestines, and it would soak up the excess fluids and stop your diarrhea. Well, the original formula of kaopectate is not the same as what we had when we were kids. I think it was around 2016, maybe a little bit earlier than that. Kaopectate sold out to Pepto-Bismol. So now if you buy kaopectate, you're buying Pepto-Bismol. There's no more kaolin, there's no more pectin. It's not the same stuff. And we could have kaopectate as kids because it was kaolin and pectin, it was inert objects. You can't give kaopectate to kids under 18 now because it's just aspirin. It's Pepto-Bismol. Just a little FYI there, okay? So chitosan-based products have a lot of names. We have Traumostat, Hemecon, Woundstat, Celox, and Chitagaz. This substance was derived from the shells of Arctic shrimp. Not regular old Louisiana shrimp, Arctic shrimp. Very special. So they would boil these Arctic shrimp shells in sodium hydroxide, and it completely changes the chemical structure of chitosan so that it's safe to use. And then you impregnate packing with it, and it becomes a bleeding control gauze. Works great with people who are hypothermic, because remember, some of these didn't work on cooler than average temperatures. And it works great on people who are taking blood thinners like Coumadin, Xarelto, Plavix, anything like that. So this is good. They are pearl-colored, non-toxic flakes that are positively charged. If you ever had a fish and you had fish food, that's what it looks like, is pearl-colored fish food flakes. So they are positively charged, and because of that, they are attracted to the negatively charged red blood cells, because opposites attract. So when they're charged, they are attracted to each other, they meet up, they hook up, hey, how you doing? And then the flakes swell, turn into a gel, and stick together to form a clot. So only the clot, it only clots the blood that it comes in contact with, because we're like, wait a minute, if we're shoving in this gauze, what if a piece breaks off of that gel and we're going to have pulmonary, embolism? No. It stays right there. It's only going to affect the blood that comes to it. It does not activate the clotting cascade, so it doesn't change chemically what your patient's doing. Chitosan is digested by an enzyme called lysozyme. It's found in our tears, it's found in our saliva. So our bodies naturally break it down into glucosamine, which is great for our joints. So it's a win-win. Yeah. It's going to be right there. You're fine. Yeah, that's fine. I understand. It always gets asked. That's fine. So we apply chitosan, it works, and then it just breaks down naturally. So it's biodegradable, it's bioabsorbable. Our enzymes and our tears and our saliva will break it down into lysozyme, and then it's converted into glucosamine, and it's good for our joints. So back down here to your question, has never caused a hypersensitivity to those who are allergic to shellfish, because 99% of all allergic reactions are based on proteins, peanut proteins, mammal proteins, if you've got alpha-gal, or not alpha-gal sugar, but different proteins. So there's the Arctic shrimp shells that had the proteins, but remember, they were treated with sodium hydroxide. And sodium hydroxide completely changes that form to where your body does not recognize it as an offender. So they've actually had people who were deathly allergic to shellfish, and they purposefully gave them this stuff with the code cart next to them, of course. Never, not an itch, not a scratch, not a snot, not a sneeze. Yeah, it's really cool. It is not exothermic because it does not have calcium in it anymore. So X-Stat is one we're going to finish up with. This is a large, it looks like a 20 ml syringe filled with aspirin-sized tampons. They really are the size of aspirin tablets. They've got an X on them that is radiopaque, so you can see what's going on here. And they were FDA cleared. They are still pretty expensive. I don't have one to offer because of the expense, but I will show you this video and it should explain a little bit more. So I still haven't seen one, and I've priced them. They're still hundreds of dollars. So I can't justify buying one to bring it here, but it's out there and it works really, really well. I'm sure it's been 11 years now. Maybe it's a little bit more affordable. I'm not sure. Okay, so for the people in Zoom, they are available for $91 to $100, but there is a generic version now, so who knows how well that would work. So. Tourniquets and hemostatic gauze, yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. We have to have 2 tourniquets and 4 packs of hemostatic gauze in our first in bag at all times when we do truck checks. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So damage control resuscitation was developed in 1993 to treat people who had acute hemorrhage, and they're basically were trying to prevent causing the trauma triad of death. And I know you're thinking, dum, dum, dum. So this is the trauma triad of death. We've actually got another leg of the trauma triad that I need to add here, but for damage control resuscitation, this is what they were wanting to cover. This cycle, excuse me, can start at any point. It happens to be on top blood clotting problem like coagulopathy, but it can start at any place. So if you have a blood clotting problem, then you have an increase in lactic acid in your blood. That drop in pH causes your blood to become thinner, and it actually will decrease your cardiac performance. And when you have a decrease in cardiac performance, then you're not able to maintain your acid-base balance. You bleed more, and then when you bleed more, you're losing a heat source like warm blood. So then you get acidic and hypothermic aggravates the blood clotting factor. So it's a nasty snowball effect. Damage control resuscitation was developed to prevent this. So if you've been in EMS for more than, let's say, 20 or 30 years, you may have remembered the old challenge of how many liters of fluid can I get in my patient before I get to the ER, right? I want them bleeding pink because that was kind of a thing. And so they stopped that. I do remember, I've been around long enough, I do remember in ER, medics come in saying, I got 7 liters in them. They have no bleeding and their pressure is really good, and now they need to pee. But if you give them too much crystalloid fluid, you cause a lot of different things. You cause more acidosis because the pH of normal saline is like 5.6. It's acidic. It's got all that chloride in it, so you can have hyperchloremic acidosis from too much saline. There are things that are wrong with giving too much saline, and this is one of them. So this is what we're going to stop. So damage control resuscitation, early blood product transfusion. Blood is considered the fluid of choice for bleeding control. Okay, makes sense as long as you didn't bleed out too much. Maybe you did. Immediate arrest or slowing of the hemorrhage. Yes, we've got that down. We've got tourniquets, we've got direct pressure, we've got hemostatic gauze now. and then avoid massive crystalloid resuscitation. So with that, I mentioned that whole titer blood is the fluid of choice, and this is by Damage Control Resuscitation, their new guidelines for 2019. Not everyone carries whole blood. I don't. The aircraft, the helicopter service I used to work with, because I do ground now, they didn't until like last year, and now they only carry plasma. So not everyone has access to blood. So what do we do if we don't have blood? Well, there are some options here. They do say if you don't have blood, okay, first of all, whole blood is going to be #1 choice. If you don't have it, you can do plasma and then red blood cells and then platelets at a 1:1:1 ratio. Okay, so when you add all those three together, you get whole blood. So, okay, #3, plasma and packed red blood cells, a 1:1 ratio. So give a unit of plasma, give a unit of packed cells, and then back and forth. If you don't have that, you can give plasma or packed red blood cells alone. Again, we don't have any of this stuff, but we do have crystalloid. So they recommend LR or Plasma Light. Plasma Light is an LR. They are balanced solutions. They are more biocompatible with what is in our bloodstream, so they are less likely to cause complications. Now, Plasma Light A used to be only found in the ORs. I mean, you'd occasionally still, if you worked at recovery or ICU, your patient would come back and they'd have a liter of Plasma Light, and you're like, what's this stuff? And you take it down and you throw up a bag of NS. We don't do that anymore. We keep the LR or Plasma Light. You can give a lot of this if you need to, and it's not going to cause those complications that saline does. However, look at your indications. You need to give it only until you get a systolic pressure of 80 to 90. Once you've got that, slow down the fluids. If you see an improvement in mental status, slow down the fluids. If you have a palpable radial pulse, slow down those fluids. Because ultimately what they need is blood, and that's not what we have. But we're not going to make this problem any worse for them by diluting. And remember the D's of bleeding control? Don't dilute. So COTC take-home points. For a hypotensive patient with a penetrating torso injury, delay aggressive fluid resuscitation. You're going to actually help your patient out by delaying that. You're going to have improved outcomes. Patients died when we gave aggressive pre-hospital fluids. So yeah, you can give fluids just to maintain their mental status or get them a palpable pulse, but then slow it down. So TXA is also an option now. TXA has been around since the 60s. We haven't had it here in the US until like the last, 10, 15 years. So it's been around for a while. It's been studied for a while. It is over the counter in all countries except this one. So in Japan and in parts of Europe, they just go to the local pharmacy and get a big bottle of tablets. Surgeons, if you're going to go in for dental surgery, they'll say, hey, go to the local, whatever they have over there, CVS or whatever, and get a bottle of TXA or alproic acid or, tranexamic acid, whatever they called it, and take a couple of tablets every day for a week before your surgery. Women will take this for every day for the week before their period starts, and it will help control heavy bleeding. It's been around for a while, so it's fairly safe. So it is the synthetic version of the amino acid lysine, which we have in our bodies right now. So it's a synthetic version of something we already make. It is also known as Amicar, and it is available over the counter in other countries. So how this happens is, remember that platelets get activated and they're flowing around and they're making a mesh, and we have plasminogen, which is a long string. Okay, plasminogen gets in there and it weaves its way into the clot, and then it shortens, kind of like a cinch sack. It shortens and makes that clot even stronger. Now, because we are humans, we tend to start breaking down clots after a few days, and that's when fibrin comes through and starts snipping through all those plasmin threads. We don't want that to happen. So TXA actually blocks it up here. It keeps the plasminogen from shortening, and therefore it keeps the fibrin from chopping up those little bits into fibrin degradation products. So the indications would be mechanism of injury suggestive of potential major hemorrhage. A lot of times your policy will go over like specific hemodynamics because those are measurable. Mechanism of injury, not always measurable. So signs and symptoms of a hemorrhage, which would be a blood pressure less than 90 or a sustained heart rate of greater than 115. Your known injury time should be less than 3 hours. That's in trauma. We have given TXA to GI bleeds that have been going on for days. Doesn't seem to hurt anything, but so far for TXA in trauma patients, the rule is still you must have this done within 3 hours of onset of injury. Absolute contraindications is a subarachnoid hemorrhage. We don't give it there. Intravascular clotting or renal failure, because your body, your kidneys can't break down that the TXA into lysine. Other things you might want to consider is if they were given Kcentra infusions, if they're in DIC, or if they're at an increased risk for thrombosis, like clot formers. Those people who always have DVTs and PEs, that might be something you need to talk to doc about before you consider giving TXA to them. So what about bleeding control stuff in your first aid kits? I love this. They buy bleeding control spray thinking we're going to stop all the arterial bleeds in the world. Okay, so this stuff is basically like Bactine spray. It's got lidocaine in it, which takes the sting out of it, and it's got benzalkonium chloride, which is an antiseptic. There is nothing in here that's going to stop bleeding. But when you clean your abrasions, you can spray this on here. It takes the sting out of it. There is nothing in here that's going to stop bleeding. It's meant for mild abrasions, very clearly on the can, intended for mild abrasions only. So are there any questions? Let's see here, chat room. Chitosan, people who are allergic to shellfish, we answered that one, yay. Do they expire? So we would potentially just be throwing them away. Tourniquets don't expire. The hemostatic gauze does. So just kind of keep that in mind. They're both pretty expensive, but in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty cheap to invest in that to make sure you're going to save a life. Any questions from out here? Yeah.
So if you get on a scene and you've got a makeshift tourniquet already on,
Mm-hmm.
and you replace it, do you leave that makeshift on and leave your tourniquet on there too?
Yeah. If your makeshift tourniquet's working, I wouldn't bother it. Sure, yeah. Yeah, but if it is still seeping, I would probably put my tourniquet on top of the makeshift one, just as added coverage and to get that firm bleeding control. Yeah. So Carmen Pearson, thank you. You're welcome very much. Thank you for logging on. Tom, absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you very much, guys.
Good job.
Thank you.